Okay, I need to get something off my chest. Steven Spielberg is underrated as hell. I know it's a weird thing to say about one of, if not the most famous filmmaker of all time, but he's such an icon that his work gets a lot of criticism, and I feel like a lot of that critique has overshadowed the fact that Spielberg is an absolute genius and a master at his craft. I sometimes don't think people quite understand just how influential Spielberg has been. Man pretty much invented the blockbuster, and as time has gone on, he's proven to be one of the most adept and versatile directors out there. From the get-go, he's been consistently ambitious, with his first film, Duel, being a simple yet nail-bitingly tense thriller that is filmed in and around cars, something that is incredibly difficult, especially for where the technology was at the time. The fact that his TV movie debut was so tight and exciting was astounding, yet he was just getting started, as he went on to make some of the greatest films ever made throughout his prolific and varied career. Even the films of his I don't like, I greatly appreciate for how committed Spielberg is to their tone and aesthetic. Saving Private Ryan is military propaganda, but it's the best piece of military propaganda I've ever seen. It puts you in the shoes of these helpless troops as they cautiously make their way across a grim and perilous landscape. And while I find the movie to be almost masturbatory in how uncritical it is of the US military, I can't fault it for being as memorably mapped out and unforgettably presented it is. I can still remember the story from beginning to end long after viewing it because of how well Spielberg strings along locations and tones to create something that, while I personally still dislike, I still respect and absolutely get the appeal of. But his duds are far outweighed by the amount of sheer bangers he's made. The man is a workhorse, and after making over 30 movies, he's still going strong, with West Side Story being one of his best movies yet. Spielberg's intuition as a filmmaker shows itself best in the fact that he's only even co-written 2 of the films he's directed, instead being able to adapt any text into these monolithic and engaging classics. In fact, most of the criticism I see levied at Spielberg should instead be addressed to the screenwriters, as even when the scripts are at their worst, Spielberg tries his best to make them into fully functional worlds, teeming with life and atmosphere. One of my favorite films of his is War of the Worlds, a full-fledged post-9/11 panic attack, and one of the most viscerally terrifying movies I've ever seen, but I agree with the common consensus that the ending is pretty weak. But even so, Spielberg shouldn't be blamed for structural issues, and I find that the light at the end of the cold, dark, relentless tunnel is nice in its own right. I think one of Spielberg's best adaptations comes in the film Catch Me If You Can, which only shifts the true events of the story when it helps to dramatize and punctuate the film. The plotline with Frank's dad isn't really true, but the theme of father figures in the film wouldn't be the same without it, and it adds another layer of emotional depth to make it a truly unique experience. Catch Me If You Can blends excitement and melancholy together so effortlessly that it made me feel unexplainable emotions that I've never felt before, and I think that's a running theme in Spielberg's work at his best. See, while I love his pulpy films like the scrappy DILF adventure of Jaws, the trans as hell Jurassic Park, and the disgustingly entertaining Temple of Doom, Spielberg's best films, in my eyes, are the ones that explore emotion in real thematic depth. From the complex and emotionally intense look at Jewish identity and history that Schindler's List is, to the series of films he made post 9/11 that are all reactions to that event in one way or another, Spielberg is at his best when he does have something to say. I know part of why West Side Story is so good is because it tackles things like the social construction of race and gender, adding tenfold to the undeniable feeling that the tragic events of the story could have been avoided. While not everything has to be deep to be good, as Spielberg proves with the epitome of comfort food that is The Terminal, his moral quandaries in films like the absolute masterpiece Minority Report shows that entertaining films don't have to stop and start with action and tension, but can also create out fleshed out worlds and probing ideological conversations without taking away from the thrills. That movie makes me giddy from how balls to the wall tense it is, but it also presents interesting things to think about given the nature of its world. Munich is also one of his best films precisely because of this, being an incredibly tense and thoroughly interesting film, but also a deathly serious look at cycles of violence. It's a testament to Spielberg's sheer brilliance that he was able to make the only piece of media I've ever seen to successfully tackle the Israel-Palestine conflict, being nuanced without coming off as centristy or didactic in the slightest. This is to say nothing of his best film, AI. Okay, so I know AI is a pretty controversial film, but in my opinion, this is one of the greatest films ever made, and needs more attention. I'd like to make a full video on it someday, but suffice it to say that it is a story in a world that feels completely timeless, and much like its main character, will live on long after we will. Also, the ending is the best part, and those who complain about it are just wrong. I think it's his ultimate achievement, not just because it's an incredible film in every aspect, but because of how he was able to carry on the ideas of Stanley Kubrick and make it into something good. I guess while I'm throwing out hot takes, I should say that I think Kubrick is an incredibly overvalued director. He was, famously, an abusive and horrible person, and he's only made one film that didn't leave me completely cold, and that's why I find AI so impressive. Spielberg was able to translate those interesting and ambitious but emotionally flat ideas into something with real power and weight, something that's so atmospheric and otherworldly that it blows even the best Kubrick movies out of the water. It's also worth noting to me that the 2 films that Spielberg was involved in writing are also his 2 best films, the other being Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That movie is kind of a summation of why Spielberg is so great, as it presents such a bizarre and at times bonkers situation, yet it's operating at 110% to make sure you don't perceive it that way. He has a knack for getting you into the mind of his characters, and as such, his films helped me to become a more empathetic person. Spielberg's films are humanist propaganda, and I'm all for it. Watching Spielberg's films, I'm struck by just how many different languages are used, and how many different cultures are explored. And, in spite of the lack of subtitles, I've never had a problem with understanding the dialogue. This is the core of why Spielberg is the most famous director. He's a master translator. No matter the ethnicity, Spielberg's greatest skill as a filmmaker is ultimately communication, from the film to the audience, because art is a universal form of communication. Art is what brings us together. And Spielberg understands that in spades. Now, are there salient critiques of Spielberg to be made? Absolutely. I'm not a fan of his simping for Lincoln or the US military. His films are frequently overlong, and it did take a minute for him to fully adjust to making serious movies, as films like Always and The Color Purple, while I do really like the latter, are a bit tone-deaf in places. This is to say nothing of his involvement in the Twilight Zone movie, or the sheer racism of Temple of Doom, but you probably don't want to hear my takes on the Indiana Jones movies. Regardless, I've always respected Spielberg, but it wasn't until I made student films that I was able to fully appreciate how utterly excellent he is at his job. Spielberg is one of the best to ever do it, and I'm tired of seeing him slandered. Please, put some respect on my man Stevie's name. Thanks for watching.